We are in the middle of a pretty insane free agency class, so I want to take a step back and go ahead and just take a look at a couple of the biggest losers of the 2025 NFL free agency period so far. Subscribe if you're new, let's hop into it. Before we get into my official list, I did want to hand out a couple of honorable mentions. Those honorable mentions are going to be the Ravens, the Browns, and the Bengals, essentially most of the AFC North. Most of these teams just haven't really done much, and for the sake of like the Bengals, you have the Trey Hendrickson situation. For the Browns, you've only been able to re-sign Myles Garrett. You still have Deshaun Watson on your roster. You also brought in Kenny Pickett, so that kind of sucks. And for the Ravens, they just haven't done anything. Bringing back Ronnie Stanley was great, but you lose Patrick McCarry, and outside of that, you haven't really done anything. So that's why you're on my honorable mention. But with that said, we're going to talk about the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Pittsburgh Steelers have been, honestly, they've been active, but they haven't been active in getting players that I think really makes their situation better. Now, I want to say this. I'm recording this at around noon on Tuesday, so we haven't gotten the news about Aaron Rodgers, and it does sound like Aaron Rodgers is leaning towards becoming a Pittsburgh Steeler. And even if he does become a Steeler, or if he does not become a Steeler, I still think the Steelers are basically one of the bigger losers of the free agency period so far. In terms of who they've made moves for, they went ahead and picked up Malik Harrison as a rotational linebacker. It's a 2-year, $10 million deal. They also, of course, traded a second-round pick for DK Metcalf. I really do not like the trade. It doesn't really make a bunch of sense. He's an outside X-style wide receiver who likes to make big plays downfield. Basically, I don't want to say the same player as George Pickens, but a very similar play style to George Pickens. And it's really hard to run an offense with two very similar players, especially when both those players don't have much versatility to play like a different position. A good example of what I'm talking about in terms of how this could work for other teams is if, let's say, you have a CeeDee Lamb, for example, who is a very versatile guy who can play on the slot, can play on the outside. If you were to pair CeeDee Lamb up with like a Mecca Egbuka or Luther Burden in this year's draft class, who are both primarily slot guys who can also do a little bit on the outside, you do have that versatility to kind of move the pieces around however you deem fit in your offense. But with DK Metcalf and George Pickens, neither one of those guys can really play any other position than like an outside true X wide receiver. So yes, you technically could have two outside wide receivers and just make a bunch of big long throws down the field, but just feel like that's not a very explosive I just feel like that's not really a functional offense, especially come down to playoff time. I will say I do think the Pittsburgh Steelers are going to be throwing some absolute heaters down the field, and they're going to be making a lot of big time plays, but when you go up against a good team that knows how to cover down the field with some good safeties, I think the Steelers offensively could have some issues. And with the other thing too is, I mean, Aaron Rodgers is getting up there in age. I don't expect Aaron Rodgers to be going out there and just throwing nuclear bombs all over the field to Pickens and DK Metcalf. Also, another thing on top of that, Rodgers' personality with Metcalf's personality with George Pickens' personality just does not feel like a really good fit. The team has also lost key pieces like Najee Harris, Landon Roberts, a couple other pieces here and there. So yeah, I'm just not a huge fan of what the Steelers have done so far, and we'll see what they do at the quarterback position. This could all change if they go out there and get Aaron Rodgers, or they skip on him and decide to go for a quarterback in this year's draft class. Either way, I'm just not a huge fan of what Pittsburgh's doing right now. Next is the Atlanta Falcons. Now, to be fair to the Falcons, they haven't really been able to do anything because they're kind of broke right now. They don't really have much cap space to work with, and it is basically the biggest reason why they're on this list. They had to let go of guys like Grady Jarrett. Obviously, they were able to give some extensions out to guys like Jake Matthews and their long snappers, so those were obviously worthwhile moves, but the only external signing they've done so far was Divine Diablo on a 2-year, $14 million deal, which I think Divine Diablo is a good player, but I mean, 2 years, 14 feels a little bit expensive for his type of play, but I mean, at the same time, I can understand why the Falcons would do so. Again, to kind of just reiterate what I said earlier, the Falcons are on this list because they just don't have any money to spend, and they haven't really done anything to open up any cap space. Last offseason, they were super aggressive to address some of their issues. They went out there, picked up Kirk Cousins, and they double dipped and decided to get Michael Penix Jr. Now that decision is kind of biting them in the ass right now because, hypothetically speaking, if they did not sign Kirk Cousins and just went all in with Michael Penix Jr., they would have like $40-something million of cap space to work with, again, hypothetically speaking here. But instead, you've had to move off of one of your better defensive linemen in Grady Jarrett, so now your defensive line is just significantly worse now, both in the interior and on the edge rushing room, and you haven't really done anything to address your positions of need, and in some ways, you kind of can't fix those issues because you just don't have any money to do so unless you can find a trade partner or find a way to get off the Kirk Cousins deals like immediately. But because that doesn't seem like it's going to happen, you find yourself in a situation where financially you're kind of in a stranglehold and you really can't build the defense that can support a young quarterback like Michael Penix Jr. So unfortunately for the Atlanta Falcons, I kind of feel like you just have to play out this Kirk Cousins situation for another year or so and hope that it can figure its way out, and maybe you can find a trade partner to open up some cap space, because I don't think you want a $40 million backup quarterback, or at least I would assume they don't want to do so. So yeah, it's unfortunate for the Falcons. They're likely going to have to build within the draft, and if they can nail the draft, I think they could be a good team next year. But unfortunately, I just don't know if there's enough great players in this year's draft class to support this defense and make this defense go from being not so good, or I shouldn't say not so good, not great, to becoming great. But they're going to have an excellent draft class, and it's going to be quite difficult, especially with some of the people they have lost. Moving to number 5 is the Seattle Seahawks. Now, in some ways, I think the Seahawks aren't losers, but at the same time, you cannot ignore all the pieces that they have moved off of. The Seahawks are essentially hitting a hard reset button. They've moved off of DK Metcalf. They moved off of Tyler Lockett. They're moving off of a lot of different pieces on the offensive end, obviously Geno Smith as well. And they're replacing those guys with basically nobody so far. Obviously, they brought in Sam Darnold. That was their big ticket free agent so far. And to be honest with you, I don't necessarily dislike the move of getting Sam Darnold, because I view it as a more long-term play than Geno Smith. I think Geno Smith is a better quarterback than Sam Darnold, but Sam Darnold is about, 6 or 7 years younger. He still has a little bit of room to grow. He's also on a cheaper deal. It's only a 3-year deal, so it's a kind of I don't want to say a risk-free move, because there is some level of risk to it, but it's not an extremely risky move, like potentially committing long-term to like a Geno Smith. But again, this team is hitting a very hard reset button. I mean, let's just kind of go off the list here. Geno Smith traded away, DK Metcalf traded away, release of Tyler Lockett, Draymond Jones, Roy Robertson Harris, Rashawn Jenkins, and George Fant. The only moves they've made this offseason were bringing in Sam Darnold, bringing in Josh Jones to be what I'm assuming is going to be a swing tackle, maybe potentially a starting tackle if some injuries were to occur. You re-signed Ernest Jones and Jaron Reed, which both are really good deals, by the way. So yeah, so far the Seahawks really haven't done anything. They've lost a ton of pieces on both sides of the ball, and they haven't really replaced those pieces. And if you look at their salary cap situation, they actually have a good number of salary cap. Now, I don't think this is fully updated, but as of when I'm recording this, they're around $60 million in cap space. I don't think this is taken into account Darnold's deal though, so they probably have around $20 or $30 million of cap space to work with right now, and I'm sure they'll make some more moves. And I also probably should have said this at the beginning of the video, but all these teams still have time to make moves, but I don't really see the Seahawks going out there and being terribly aggressive and finding pieces immediately. This kind of feels like a team that's going to play it a little bit safer and not put themselves in a financial stranglehold early on and make a mistake like the Falcons did. But at the same time, Sam Darnold is going from an offense where he had Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, Aaron Jones, some good offensive line play. I know it was bad towards the back end of the year, but you know, and a good defense too. And now he's going into a situation where he has a worse offensive line, and his number 1 weapon is Jackson Smith and Jigba, and his number 2 is like Jake Bobo or Noah Fant. So, and not to mention his running backs, they're good running backs, but they don't have an offensive line to support a ground game. And so I don't really like what the Seahawks have done so far. Again, they still have some time to make some moves around the edges to add a wide receiver, maybe like a Stephon Diggs or a Keenan Allen. I think that could make some sense. They also have some time to add some pieces to the offensive line, but a lot of the big name free agents are already off the board. And for Seattle, I kind of feel like they're waiting a little bit too long to make some moves now. So we'll have to wait and see, but I just don't think that they've done enough right now to support their quarterback in Sam Darnold. And again, I like the Sam Darnold move, but I don't like any of the other moves they've made outside of obviously re-signing their players, but they just haven't really done anything. So for Seattle, I'm gonna have them on this list, but I think they could potentially move into like a more winner side of things if they have a bit more of an aggressive day 2 or day 3. Next up is the Dallas Cowboys. Now, listen, the Dallas Cowboys are on basically every single video that comes out every year when people do their biggest losers of free agency. The Dallas Cowboys are on there every single year, and I mean, it's kind of their own doing. They just don't do anything half the time. Now, I will say they've been a little bit more aggressive this year, more so than in past years. Like last year, they didn't sign a player till like 4 or 5 days into the process, and this year they've at least signed 2 players yesterday and so far 1 today, but those players are just depth options. So far they've obviously re-signed Osa Digizua. By the way, great contract, 4 years, $80 million is an absolute steal for them. Also brought back their long snapper and brought back a special teams ace in CJ Goodwin. But you signed Javonte Williams, who I'm assuming is going to be more of a receiving back, probably your second or third option. You bring in Robert Jones or Rob Jones, somebody who was a starter last year for the Dolphins, but obviously a starting offensive lineman for the Dolphins is kind of all you need to know. He was not very good, but again, maybe it was a situation issue where he's maybe more of a downhill blocker, which is something that Miami isn't going to do too much because they're more of a zone scheme type of system. So maybe he's more of a downhill guy, which Dallas can be at times. So maybe that's the case, and maybe he could be good for Dallas. I don't know if he'll start, but at the same time, they do have a positional need at right guard, so maybe he could start. They also brought in Solomon Thomas on a 2-year, $8 million deal, which I don't hate the move. Solomon Thomas has been an okay player in the NFL, obviously not worthy of, what was it, like a top 10 pick, but he gives you a little bit of juice. Last year, he had 4 sacks, but the Cowboys are bad against the run, and Solomon Thomas is only 6'2", 256, and he had a 41.5 run defense grade. So that doesn't really give you anything that you didn't already have in the interior of your defensive line. You already had a good pass rusher in Osa Odighizuwa, and unless you plan on putting Solomon Thomas out there on the edge, then I don't know what we're really doing here. They've also lost their starting nickel in Jordan Lewis. They also lost their swing tackle in Chuma Edoga. It sounds like they're going to lose Rico Dowell, their starting running back. For the second year in a row, they're losing their starting running back. And they haven't really addressed any of their issues. I look at this Cowboys team, and this team has a number of big time issues: a running back 1, a wide receiver 2, a right guard. I mean, unless Robert Jones can fill in that spot, but we'll see on that one. Some potential help with the tackle room because both your tackles have big time question marks. An edge rusher next to Micah Parsons if you don't bring back DeMarcus Lawrence. Your linebackers, I mean, they haven't re-signed Eric Kendricks. Their only capable linebacker is Morris Lafau, who was a 3rd-round linebacker last year. And their secondary is extremely questionable because both Deron Bland and Trevon Diggs can never seem to stay healthy, and now you just lost maybe your most consistent player on defense, which is Jordan Lewis. So Cowboys haven't done anything. They haven't addressed any of their issues. They haven't been aggressive per usual. And again, I understand their mindset of building within the draft, but you use free agency to supplement your draft picks, and they're not doing so right now. And the funny thing too is the Cowboys actually have a lot of cap space to work with. They restructured the deals of CeeDee Lamb and Dak Prescott, so they had about $50 million to work with. And yes, you don't want to sign long-term deals, so I can understand not going for big name guys, but you can still make some moves around the edges, and so far they haven't done so. They haven't made any big time commitments to anybody, and I just think the Cowboys are getting worse and worse and worse within the division. Next is the Philadelphia Eagles. Now this one was always bound to happen. The Philadelphia Eagles have been doing a lot of financial gymnastics. I mean, they have been moving around the cap space at an incredible level the past couple years, getting contracts done early, doing the right restructures, so on and so forth. But eventually they were going to have an offseason where they were going to lose a good amount of players, and that just happens to be this offseason. Now, to get the positives out the way, you bring back Zach Bond. You also give an extension to Saquon Barkley. Both were really good moves. Also, you bring in Dorian Thompson-Robinson, which I think is a fantastic move to be your backup quarterback. You also traded for Kenyon Green, which I don't love the trade, but if there is a team that could go out there and turn a first-round bust into a starter, it would be the Philadelphia Eagles. Hell, they just did it with freaking Mekhi Becton. So potentially Kenyon Green could be a good fit for that offensive line. It'll be pretty interesting to see what happens there. But you lose Josh Sweat, you lose Milton Williams, you lose Darius Slay, you lose CJ Gardner-Johnson. I mean, you're losing a lot of pieces on your team, and don't get me wrong, this Eagles team still is fantastic, and I still think they can easily make another Super Bowl run because they still have their main core group of guys. But this team is starting to have a few more holes that they didn't have last year that they kind of have now. Like, they really need an edge rusher. They really need a corner opposite of Darius Slay. I mean, unless they feel confident that maybe Cooper DeJean can fill out there, that's maybe something that could happen, or they'll look to do that in the draft. Your offensive line, maybe you don't feel as confident now because you lose Mekhi Becton. So yeah, I mean, again, this team is still going to be fantastic, but there are more holes now than there were prior to free agency starting, which again, we all kind of knew was going to happen. This team was going to lose free agents, so you really can't be too mad at the Eagles for doing this because they've been super aggressive in years past, but they haven't really made any game-changing moves. And when it comes to the Kenyon Green for CJ Gardner-Johnson trade, I really don't like that move. Last year via PFF, CJ Gardner-Johnson had an 82.6 coverage grade, a 76 overall grade, only allowed 22 receptions, had 6 picks for you, 41 solo tackles, played 900 snaps in your defense. Very versatile guy, can play deep in safety, can play more a strong safety role, can even play in the nickel. And you had so much versatility there, and maybe you didn't want to pay his future contract, but I don't know. I think I'd much rather have CJ Gardner-Johnson than Kenyon Green. I mean, I guess that Kenyon Green can be developed into this Eagle system and they can make it work, which I'm sure they will. But again, I'd rather them keep CJ Gardner-Johnson on this defense, continue the continuity in their secondary, and then then draft an offensive lineman in the first round or second round of next year's draft and just make it work there. But instead, they're taking on Kenyon Green, who I don't know what I'm going to be getting out of. You're also losing 2 starting secondary members in Darius Slay and CJ Gardner-Johnson, and you haven't replaced those guys because they haven't really signed anyone quite yet. So while I like some of the moves they've made, I also feel like this team has taken a big step back defensively. They're losing key rotational guys on the defensive line. You're trusting now Nolan Smith to probably be one of your premier pass rushers, same with Bryce Huff. And then you also lose 2 starting secondary members. Again, this is all bound to happen. It just kind of feels like right now they haven't been making the best decisions, which again, it was bound to happen. Next is the Houston Texans. Now, the Houston Texans have been unbelievably busy so far, so just hear me out on this. I'm going to go through everything that they have done so far. They traded Laramie Tunsil, they traded Kenyon Green, they got CJ Gardner-Johnson, which you guys just know my thoughts on. I really like the move. They signed Laken Tomlinson, which I'm assuming is going to be their replacement for Shaq Mason. Laken Tomlinson is okay. He's not very good. You traded for Christian Kirk. That's a good move. You re-signed Dar Ogunbowale, your running back. You re-signed Mario Edwards. You re-signed Derek Barnett. You re-signed a linebacker, Jake Henson. You re-signed MJ Stewart. You signed Tremon Smith to a 2-year, $7.5 million deal. You signed Justin Watson. You signed Braxton Berrios. You signed Sheldon Rankins, and you signed Darrell Taylor. So they've made a lot of moves, and I think the team has gotten better in some ways, but I think it's gotten significantly worse in other ways. Let's just get this out the way. This offensive line, it sucks. It's bad. This offensive line went from not good to really bad. They traded away Laramie Tunsil for, I think, a couple picks. And now your starting offensive line looks like Zach Thomas, Titus Howard, Jarrett Patterson, Kendrick Green, and Blake Fisher. I mean, that is a really bad offensive line. And sure, maybe Laken Tomlinson can fill in at maybe right guard or something like that, or maybe he plays left guard and you move Titus Howard back out to tackle. But I mean, that offensive line is really bad. You also haven't re-signed Stephon Diggs, so he's likely out the door, which again, Christian Kirk replaces his productivity, so that's not that big of a loss. But I just look at this offensive line and I think it's arguably the worst offensive line in the NFL. And for some reason, you traded Laramie Tunsil, which makes no sense. Laramie Tunsil was a fantastic player. Yes, the penalty issues last year were pretty difficult to work with, but I mean, he's still one of the best pure protectors and blockers in the NFL, and yet you traded him for a couple draft picks. And sure, maybe you want to go younger in the offensive line, and maybe you feel like you can draft 3 to 4 offensive linemen this year in draft and build a young unit that can be CJ Stroud's protectors for the foreseeable future. But this is a team that's in the middle of their window with their quarterback on a rookie deal, and they're trying to compete for championships now. And their offensive line is nowhere near good enough to actually win a championship right now. Like, I look at this offensive line and I maybe see like 2 starters, and maybe 2 starters, even a bit of a stretch. I see like 1 true starter and maybe a couple guys who could be a starter in a pinch. So they have to look to address 3 to 4 of their offensive lineman spots, and they haven't done so far. They haven't signed a single offensive lineman outside of Laken Tomlinson. And obviously, I like some of the moves they've made. I think CJ Gardner-Johnson is going to add so much to this defense. I think bringing in Darrell Taylor was a nice move. Bringing back Derek Barnett, even bringing in Justin Watson, I like the move a lot. But they have not addressed the offensive line at all, and I think that was their biggest need of the offseason, and they've done nothing but got significantly worse at it by moving off of Laramie Tunsil. So now I look at this team and I think that their potential window to win a championship is kind of closed because of how bad this unit is actually going to be next year. Again, maybe they know something that I don't know, but this offensive line was not good last year and it got significantly worse so far. So unless they make some big time moves, they still have plenty of time to do so, then I guess we'll have to wait and see. I think this defense is going to be really good next year. I mean, they have a lot of really versatile guys on the defense. Maybe you want another cornerback outside of Derek Stingley, but at the same time, you can move Kamari Lassiter to outside corner and just move CJ Gardner-Johnson to more of a nickel role. So I think this defense is going to be fantastic, but I look at this offense and I think that offensive line is going to hold this team back tremendously unless they can make some big time moves. So I got the Houston Texans as one of my losers so far. But of course, one of the bigger losers we got to talk about is the San Francisco 49ers. And this one is kind of similar to the Eagles, where it was like we kind of expected the San Francisco 49ers to be kind of ravaged with free agency. They haven't really done anything. They've signed a few players. Luke Farrell, by the way, terrible deal. 3-year, $20 million deal for it's going to be a backup tight end. I'm going to assume they're going to run a lot of 2 tight end packages, but this is somebody who in 2024 only had 12 receptions for 67 yards. Again, he had an injury, I do believe. But in 2023, 13 receptions for 155 yards. 2022, 2022, 4 receptions for 40 yards. 2021, 7 receptions for 56 yards. So why do you get a 3-year, $20 million deal? That makes no sense to me. They also brought in Richie Grant, who maybe can be your starter, and Patrick Taylor Jr., who's going to be a rotational running back for you. But you released Javon Hargrave, makes sense. You released Malik Collins, makes sense. You got rid of Deebo Samuel in a trade, which also made sense. But you lose Aaron Banks, you lose Talanoa Hufanga, you lose Dre Greenlaw, you lose Charvarius Ward. Yeah, and this Niners team, it's not very good. I don't even think they've gotten the contract done with Brock Purdy quite yet. So, I mean, this team, they are in a absolute pickle of a situation right now. Their offensive line, I think, is still capable. I think their offensive line is fine. I think they could still look for a young swing tackle now, like a Kelvin Banks, because they also lost their swing tackle. The receiving core I still think is okay. Like, I think the offense should be fine next year. I still can't get over the Luke Farrell deal. That one makes no sense to me. But I look at the defense, and I mean, it's not very good. The interior of the defensive line is weak. Your linebacking core is now a bit of a weakness because you don't have Fred Warner. Your secondary, I think you have some young pieces that you're liking there, like Malik Mustafa, Jair Brown, Renardo Green. There's some pieces there, but I think you would really like another cornerback out there. But listen, this Niners team is going to be competitive because I think they have a good head coach. I think they have a good young quarterback. I think they have a decent enough offense to carry what is going to be a defense that looks very different next year. And in an offseason where you bring in a new defensive coordinator, obviously Robert Saleh comes back to town, and he doesn't really have a whole lot of his old pieces to work with again. I mean, he doesn't have Dre Greenlaw, Charvarius Ward anymore. He doesn't have a safety anymore. So there's going to be a lot of turnover going on with this Niners team. And I will say, I think they've made some good moves so far by moving off of certain players. I mean, they had to cut a little bit of their fat off this team, like a Javon Hargrave, like a Deebo Samuel, no pun intended, but they had to get rid of a bit of the fat. But then they counter that by giving Luke Farrell $20 million. Now, again, I think it's up to $20 million, so that's more of an incentive-based deal, but still, I mean, that's a huge contract for a tight end who's never had over 200 yards. And he's going to be your backup. And maybe he's a good blocker, but who cares? You have George Kittle. So I don't know. I think the Niners have made a lot of questionable decisions so far. They have not fixed any of their issues. They have a top, I think, the 11th pick in the draft. So they're going to be able to get a top talent in this year's draft class. And I think it's going to go a long way for this team. I still think they're going to be a good team next year, but I think they're pretty far away from being legit Super Bowl contenders because there's a lot of teams out there that are getting better, like the Detroit Lions, who brought in DJ Reed. So yeah, I'm not a fan of what San Francisco's done so far.